She laughed when she saw my truck. Not a polite laugh. Not the kind you try to hide behind your hand. She stood at the top of those front steps. The kind of steps you see in magazines, white stone, wide enough to park a car on. And she looked down at my F-250 with the cracked side mirror and the rust eating through the wheel wells, and she laughed. Clear and easy, like it cost her nothing. I almost put it in reverse right there. I'm a carpenter, have been for going on 19 years now. I do restoration work mostly. Old homes, historic properties, the kind of houses that have stories in their bones if you know how to listen. I'm not the guy you call when you want something fast and cheap. I'm the guy you call when something matters. Which is why, when the call came from Alderton House, I picked up. Alderton House sat about 40 minutes outside of Charleston, South Carolina, on a stretch of road where the oaks grow so thick overhead they swallow the afternoon light whole. I'd driven past it 100 times over the years and never thought much about it, except that it was the kind of place that makes you feel small in a good way. 3 stories of antebellum architecture, original wraparound porch, columns that had been standing since 1847. The estate had changed hands twice in my lifetime and sat empty for the last 6 years, until a woman named Vivienne Aldrich. No, wait, that name's been used. Her name was Rosalind Beckett. Rosalind Beckett had made her money in commercial real estate, not inherited money, which I respect. She'd built it herself over 30 years, starting with a duplex in Columbia when she was 24 and ending up with a portfolio that stretched across 6 states. She was 61 years old. She wore her silver hair like a crown, and she had bought Alderton House the previous spring with the stated intention of restoring it to its original condition, which is how my name ended up on her desk. Her daughter was the one who called me. Her name was June. No, that one's in the list too. Her daughter's name was Petra. Petra Beckett was 32. She handled her mother's personal affairs, which I understood to mean she was the one who actually made things happen, while Rosalind decided what she wanted. She'd been professional on the phone. Efficient. She gave me the address, the timeline, the general scope of the project, and told me to be there at 9 on a Tuesday morning. I showed up at 8:55 with my truck, my tools, and my son. His name is Oliver. He's 11. It was a teacher planning day and my babysitter had canceled, so Oliver was with me, sitting in the passenger seat with his book and his earbuds, and his general policy of being unbothered by most things in life. He gets that from me. Or maybe from his mother. I haven't decided yet. I pulled up the long gravel drive, and that's when Rosalind Beckett appeared at the top of her steps, and laughed. Petra appeared behind her mother a moment later. I saw her face, a quick tightening around the eyes, a small look of something that wasn't quite apology but was in that neighborhood, and then she came down the steps ahead of Rosalind and extended her hand. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "Brett," I said. "Not Brett, just Brett. 1 T. My mother had strong opinions about names. Brett." She smiled, and it was a real one. "Thank you for coming out. My mother's been eager to get started." Behind her, Rosalind had descended 3 steps and was looking at my truck the way some people look at a stray dog who's wandered onto their lawn. Not unkind, exactly. Just assessing. "You're the carpenter," she said. "Yes, ma'am. You restored the Delaney property in Somerville." I did. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at Oliver, who had gotten out of the truck and was standing beside it with his book tucked under his arm, taking in the house with the quiet, methodical attention he gives to most things that interest him. "You brought a child," Rosalind said. "Planning day at his school. He won't be in the way." She made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite disagreement, and then she turned and walked back inside. Petra watched her go. Then she looked at me. "She's not as bad as she seems," she said. I didn't say anything. In my experience, people who open with that line are usually wrong. The scope of the work was significant. The main staircase needed to be fully rebuilt. Someone had done a bad repair job on it in the 1980s using the wrong grade of pine, and it had been slowly failing ever since. The original heart pine floors on the 2nd and 3rd stories needed to be stripped and refinished. 3 sets of interior shutters had warped beyond use. And the library, a long, narrow room off the east side of the house, had a coffered ceiling that was falling apart at the joints, the result of a slow roof leak that had finally been addressed but had left its damage behind. The ceiling is what I was really there for. Coffered ceilings are unforgiving. The geometry has to be perfect, because when it's wrong, you see it immediately. The original craftsman who'd built this one had done extraordinary work. I could see that from what remained, and my job was to restore it to match, not to replace it with something close. Rosalind had made that clear during our walkthrough. She had strong opinions about the word close. Close is how you end up with a house that looks like a theme park, she said. She was standing in the library doorway, her arms folded, watching me examine the ceiling. Close is what contractors say when they mean they don't know how to do the real thing. I agree, I said. She paused, like she'd expected me to argue. You've done this kind of work before, she said. It wasn't a question. The Jennings house in Beaufort, the parlor ceiling, and the Calhoun estate in Georgetown. That one took 8 months because we had to mill the molding profiles by hand. A silence. Then, I know the Calhoun estate. It's a good house. She studied me for another moment. Then she walked away without another word. Oliver appeared at my elbow. He'd been sitting in the corner reading, but he'd apparently been paying more attention than I thought, because he looked up at me and said, "She's testing you." "I know," I said. "Are you going to pass?" I looked at the ceiling, at the ruined plasterwork and the collapsed joint work, and the water stains blooming across the original beams, at the bones of something that had once been beautiful. "That's the plan," I said. "I want to tell you something about restoration work because I think people misunderstand it. Most people think it's about fixing what's broken, making something look the way it used to look. That's part of it. But the real work, the part that takes years to learn, is listening. Old houses talk to you. Not in any mystical way. They talk in the way a machine talks to a mechanic who's spent enough time with that make and model. The creak of a board tells you about the subfloor. The pattern of a water stain tells you about the drainage. The way a door hangs tells you about the foundation. You have to learn to hear it. My father taught me that. He was a Finnish carpenter his whole life. Retired at 68, hands like worn leather, a brain full of the kind of knowledge that doesn't exist in any book. He said, "A house will tell you everything it needs if you shut up long enough to listen." I thought about my father a lot during those first weeks at Alderton House. I think because the house reminded me of him, solid and dignified and a little battered, carrying a long history that most people couldn't see. I came back 4 days a week. Oliver came with me twice during those early weeks. On days when school was out, and somewhere in there he developed a habit of sitting in the library and reading while I worked on the ceiling above him, which I'll admit made me nervous at first. But Oliver has a gift for being still in a way that most 11-year-olds don't. He sits the same way I work, quietly and with intention. Petra would sometimes stop in the doorway on her way through the house. She managed her mother's calendar, her correspondence, a half-dozen contractors and vendors and delivery schedules, all from a temporary office she'd set up in what had originally been the morning room. She was efficient and direct, and she had a habit of asking good questions. "What's that tool?" she asked one afternoon, nodding at the router I was using to clean out a damaged joint. "Router," I said. "I'm following the original profile. Whoever built this used a 2¼ inch cove. You don't see that very often. Most builders were using a 2 inch by the time this house went up." She looked at the ceiling for a moment. "How do you know what it originally looked like? The parts that survived. You read what's left and reconstruct from there." She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "That sounds like grief work." I looked at her. "Reading what's left," she said, "reconstructing from there." I didn't have an answer for that, so I went back to work, but I thought about it for the rest of the afternoon. The thing about Rosalind Beckett was this. She was difficult in the way that people are difficult when they've been disappointed enough times to build a perimeter. I recognized it. I'd built my own version of the same thing after my wife left. Not a cruel woman, not a bad woman. Just someone who had decided at some point that our life together was not the life she wanted, and who had the honesty to say so, which I gave her credit for even when it felt like falling off a cliff. Jenna and I had been married 9 years. Oliver was 4 when she left. She moved to Portland. She calls him every Sunday. We've made it work the way things can work when two people decide to be decent to each other even when it's hard. But I know what it looks like when someone has learned to keep people at a certain distance. Rosalind had been keeping me at that distance since day one. Professional, precise, not unkind, but never quite letting me be a person in her presence. I was a contractor, a function, A means to an end. That changed on a Thursday afternoon in early November. I was working late. Oliver was at his grandmother's. My mother, who lives 20 minutes from us in Goose Creek and who I would be absolutely lost without. The house was quiet. The light through the library windows was going gold the way it does in the South in November. That long, slanted afternoon light that makes everything look like it's from another century. I was on my scaffold working on a section of the ceiling near the south wall when I found the panel. It wasn't obvious. You wouldn't have seen it if you didn't know what you were looking for. It was a section of the coffered grid, one of the recessed panels between the beams, and it was slightly different from the others. The depth was off by maybe 3/8 of an inch. The paint had been applied differently, in a thicker coat, the kind of coat you use when you're trying to make something look like everything around it. I set down my tools. I took out a flashlight. I pressed along the edges of the panel. It opened. Inside was a shallow cavity, maybe 6 inches deep, and inside the cavity was a tin box, roughly 8 inches by 5, the kind of thing you'd use to keep index cards or recipe clippings. The tin was old. The surface was a faded dark green, and someone had painted a small white bird on the lid. A swallow, I thought. The metal was cold. I sat on the scaffold for a moment, looking at it. Then I climbed down and went to find Rosalind. She was in the kitchen that was still being renovated, where she'd set up a small table with a coffee maker and 2 chairs, because Rosalind Beckett was not the kind of woman to be without coffee regardless of circumstances. She was reading something on a tablet when I came in, and she looked up with the expression she usually gave me, which was neutral and slightly impatient. "There's something you should see," I said. I set the tin on the table in front of her. She looked at it. She didn't reach for it. Something shifted in her face, not dramatically, just a small movement around the eyes, like she'd felt a current of cold air. "Where did you find this?" she said. "In the library ceiling, behind a false panel." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "My grandmother grew up in this house. I hadn't known that. Her name was Annalise," she said. "She left it in 1959. She never talked about why. My mother, her daughter, grew up hearing that the house was just a place her mother couldn't go back to. We never knew more than that." She reached out and picked up the tin. She held it for a moment without opening it, the way you hold something when you're deciding whether or not you're ready. Then she opened it. Inside, folded twice and wrapped in a piece of muslin that had gone ivory with age, was a letter. I gave her privacy. I went back to the library and stood at the window and looked out at the oak trees going dark in the early evening. I could hear almost nothing. The house around me was very still. She came to the library doorway about 20 minutes later. She stood there for a moment before she spoke. "The letter is from my grandfather," she said. "Not the man I knew as my grandfather, another man. A man named Earl Giddings. He was a carpenter." I waited. "He built this ceiling," she said. She looked up at it. "Not all of it. The original was built in 1847. But there was a fire in 1954. Part of the library burned. Earl Giddings was hired to restore the damaged sections." She paused. "He and my grandmother fell in love. The light was nearly gone from the windows now. I didn't move. She was married," Rosalind said, "to a man named Chester Beckett, my mother's father. A good man, by all accounts. Respectable. She loved him, I think, in the way you can love someone who represents safety and steadiness. But Earl Giddings..." She stopped. I watched her. He wrote her every letter. They corresponded for 3 years. She kept them all in this box, and she hid the box in the ceiling he had built, because she couldn't throw them away, and she couldn't keep them anywhere. Chester might find them. She looked at the tin in her hands. She left this house in 1959. Earl Giddings moved to Georgia that same year. She married Chester, and she loved him, and she never spoke of any of this. She looked at me. And I have been sitting in that kitchen for 20 minutes, reading a letter from a man I never knew existed, who wrote to my grandmother like she was the whole world. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. "He wrote her once more," Rosalind said, "after she'd already left. The letter is dated March 1960. He says he heard she had a daughter. He says he hopes she is happy. He says..." She stopped again. "He says that if she ever reads this, she should know that the ceiling will hold, that he built it to last. That some things are built to last even when the people who built them are long gone." The library was very quiet. I looked up at the ceiling. at the sections that were original and the sections I was restoring and the way it was almost impossible now to tell the difference, which was exactly the point. He was right, I said. It's held for 70 years. She looked at me, and for the first time since I'd walked up her front steps, Rosalind Beckett looked at me like I was a person. Things changed after that. Not dramatically. Nothing about Rosalind Beckett operated dramatically. But the perimeter moved. She started stopping by the library not just to check the work but to watch it. She started asking questions the way Petra did. Real questions, not supervisory questions. One afternoon, she brought 2 cups of coffee up on a tray and set one on the edge of my scaffold and didn't say anything. Just sat in the chair Oliver usually used and read while I worked. Oliver came back on a Saturday, the one Saturday I came in to get ahead of the schedule. He walked into the library and saw Rosalind sitting there and did what Oliver does, which is assess the situation with quiet thoroughness, and then he said, "Are you the lady who owns the house?" "I am," Rosalind said. "It's a good house," Oliver said. Exactly what I'd said to her on the first day. She looked at him. Something moved across her face that I couldn't quite read. "It is," she said. "I think it's going to be even better." Oliver nodded like this confirmed something he'd already suspected. Then he sat down on the floor with his book, and they coexisted in perfect silence for 2 hours, which told me more about both of them than most conversations could. Petra appeared in the doorway sometime in the early afternoon and took in this scene. Her mother reading, Oliver on the floor, me on the scaffold overhead, and she looked at me and gave me a small smile that she covered quickly. But I saw it. I want to talk about Petra for a moment, because I've been giving you the shape of the story without giving you the truth of it. And the truth of it involves Petra. The truth is that I started listening for her footsteps. I don't know exactly when it started. It built the way things build when you're trying not to pay attention to them. Incrementally, quietly, undeniable by the time you notice it. She had a particular way of moving through the house, quick and purposeful, and I learned the sound of it. I knew when she was coming down the hall before she appeared in the doorway. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself she was my client's daughter. I told myself a lot of things. She brought me lunch one Thursday in December. Not a big thing, she was making a run to a sandwich place in town, and she said she was getting food anyway. She set a paper bag on my workbench without comment. Turkey on sourdough, which I would not have told her was my preference. I ate it sitting on the tailgate of my truck, looking out at the oaks, and I thought about how something this small can sometimes carry more weight than it looks like it should. The next week, I brought 2 coffees from the place I stopped at every morning on my way out. I set one on the corner of her desk without comment. She looked up. I went back to the library. That was December. In January, there was a problem with the staircase. I'd pulled up the bad pine from the 1980s repair and gotten down to the original substructure. And what I found there changed the scope of the job significantly. The support structure beneath the landing had been compromised. Not catastrophically, not imminently dangerous, but in a way that meant if we didn't address it now, the whole landing would fail within the next 5 years. It was the right thing to tell the client. It was also the kind of news that doubles a project budget. I brought it to Rosalind directly. I laid it out straightforwardly, what I found, what it meant, what it would cost to fix. I showed her photographs. I showed her the engineering report from the structural consultant I'd called in. She listened to all of it without interruption. Then she said, "Why are you telling me yourself instead of having someone send me a change order?" "Because you should hear it from the person who found it," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. Chester, my grandfather, used to say that the measure of a man wasn't what he built but what he told you when the building went wrong. She approved the additional work that afternoon. Petra knocked on the library doorframe on a Friday evening in February. It was late. I was the only one still in the house. The ceiling was nearly done, and I'd been pushing to finish a particular section so I could start the final phase of molding installation the following week. The light was on in the library, making a warm rectangle in the otherwise dark house. She was still in her work clothes. She had her coat over her arm like she'd been on her way out and then hadn't left. "You're here late," she said, "getting close to the end. I always push at the end." She came into the library and looked up at the ceiling. The section I'd been working on was finished, and for the first time, the whole north half of the room was complete. The coffered grid clean and precise and matched to the original work so seamlessly that you had to look very hard to find where one ended and the other began. "It looks incredible," she said. "Your great-grandmother's first husband built the original," I said. I'd been thinking about Earl Giddings for weeks. He knew what he was doing. She was quiet for a moment. "Mom told me about the letter." She looked at me. "She said you didn't read it. It wasn't mine to read." "She noticed that," Petra said. "She noticed you didn't ask to read it either." I didn't say anything. Petra turned away from the ceiling and looked at me directly. "She said you remind her of Earl Giddings. She meant that as the highest compliment she has." I set down my tool and looked at her. "I know you have a son," she said. "I know you pick him up from school on Wednesdays because that's the day you always leave by 3. I know your father was a carpenter too because you mentioned it once in passing, and I've been thinking about it since." She paused. "I'm not good at this part. I'm very good at logistics and very bad at this part." "I've noticed," I said. "A beat." "But I'm trying," she said. I looked at her standing in the library of this house that her great-grandmother had left and never returned to. I thought about Earl Giddings in 1960, writing a letter he must have known she'd never answer, hiding it in the ceiling he'd built with his own hands and telling her. "Some things are built to last. There's a diner in Somerville I go to on Saturday mornings," I said. "Oliver usually comes." "It's not exactly a romantic suggestion." She smiled. It was the realest smile I'd seen from her yet. "I like diners," she said, "and I like your son." "Then I'll see you Saturday," I said. The ceiling was finished in late March. I stood in the library on the last day and looked at it for a long time. Oliver stood next to me, his neck craned back, taking in the whole thing with his particular brand of quiet evaluation. "You can't tell," he said finally. "That's the goal," I said. "Which parts are the new ones?" I showed him. The east half of the room, the 2 sections near the south wall, the detailed molding around the central recess. The parts I'd built. He studied them carefully and then looked at the original sections, and I watched him trying to find the seam. "It really looks the same," he said. He sounded slightly awed, which from Oliver is high praise. "It should look the same in 100 years," I said. "That's the job." Rosalind was there for the final walkthrough. She stood in the center of the room and looked up for a long time without speaking. Petra stood beside her. Finally, Rosalind said, "My grandmother sat in this room when she was a girl. Before the fire, before any of it." I didn't say anything. "She would have been glad," Rosalind said. She looked at me. "I'm glad." She shook my hand. Rosalind Beckett, the woman who had laughed at my truck from the top of her steps 7 months earlier, shook my hand with both of hers. That was 14 months ago. Oliver and Petra have a standing argument about which of the 2 historical fiction series she keeps recommending to him is better. An argument I understand to be a form of deep mutual respect. My mother has met Rosalind twice, which I say with the awareness that my mother meeting someone twice means she has fully adopted them into her personal universe. Rosalind appears to feel the same way about my mother, which tells you something about both of them. We found out last spring that Earl Giddings had a son. His name was Marcus. No, that one's in the list. His name was Douglas. Douglas Giddings. He's 74 years old, lives in Macon, Georgia, and had no idea his father had built the ceiling at Alderton House or left anything behind in it. Rosalind wrote him a letter. She included photographs of the tin box and of the letter inside. She told him that his father had built something extraordinary and that it had lasted. He wrote back. They've been corresponding since. There's talk of him coming to see the house. I don't know how that story ends. I think some things don't need an ending, or they find their own ending, in their own time, the way a house settles into itself over decades. Slowly, quietly, until one day you realize it has become exactly what it was always meant to be. My father used to say, "Build like it matters," because someday someone you'll never meet is going to put their hands on what you made and decide what kind of person you were. I think about that a lot in this work. I think about it when I look at the ceiling at Alderton House. The old parts and the new parts, seamless where they meet, carrying between them a story that almost didn't survive. If you have something you've been meaning to say to someone, a thank you, an apology, and I've been thinking about you, don't wait until the only place left to put it is inside a wall. Say it while they can still hear it.